Pardon me for being a little extra disheveled today. I have some other stuff to do and I'm trying to squeeze this video in really quickly in the middle of the day. But I've been promising this one for a little while, and it is a tour of my bookshelf, particularly the shelf that I use for reference for writing fantasy novels. It's pretty much all nonfiction. Over my entire life, I have been cultivating a selection of books that inform and inspire me for writing fantasy worlds. And like, the internet can give you anything in theory these days, but I feel like you just can't beat pulling a book off the shelf and having it at hand when you need some reference. And most of these I've accumulated at thrift stores, used bookstores, other kind of scavengy sources. I also work at a used bookstore, so a few things have come in there. And some I have bought, particularly around the holidays. There's often some pretty good sales on books on Amazon that often Target will also match. So I might hit one or both of those sales to get some of those more special books that you just know you're never going to find used. But before I get to those books, I have a few people wanted to see my new little bookshelf, which is all my to be read pile, like dream on. But this is all fiction. I also have a nonfiction to be read pile that is usually incorporated, like kind of shoved onto the reference shelf. And then like a lot of my manga are also to be read. So I could just retire now and work on my project. But, you know, this is the fiction shelf. So the to be read shelf, I'm working on Mistborn. I'm working on Anne of Avonlea for my Ellen Montgomery reading. I've got the Moomins box set, which I've read some of the Moomins books a long time ago, out of order, you know, I don't really even remember which ones. So I got this like last year for Christmas so that I could finally finish reading the Moomins. This is the Anne of Green Gables that I just finished. And here's a few of the nonfiction that I have to read. I also have this poor teddy bear that I got at the Goodwill bins. I don't need him, but he's a vintage teddy bear, and I was just like, you poor little guy. And I've got some library books. I'm working on Frankenstein and a Heart So Fierce and Broken. And I've got Witch of Blackbird Pond, based on a recommendation by Teresa of Teresa's Chaotic Corner YouTube channel, which I'm a big fan of. It's a lot of fun. I've already read Howl's Moving Castle, but I want to read it again because it's been a while. I'm almost done with this delightful manga. And then just kind of miscellaneous collection of mostly fantasy novels and a few Georgette Hires that are kind of beat. We got a collection in at work that was basically every Georgette Hire. Is it Hare or Hire? It's, you know, when you only see things written and not said. But anyway, I took a few of the most like too poor of condition to sell home. And then I've got some more, you know, a lot of fantasy down here. I also have a Barnes & Noble credit card. So sometimes I get new things there whenever I get in the gift card that you get like periodically. It's not like it's the best credit card for rewards, but the good thing about it is that you can only spend the rewards on fun stuff, which is kind of just a nice treat. So I like it for that reason. I just have to say, this cover of Louis McMaster Bujold's Shards of Honor is just such a like early computer graphics moment. It's so ugly. But yeah, that's some of it. I'm particularly excited to read A Far Wilder Magic because I've heard it just sounds kind of like a me book, but you never know until you actually read it. Some of these I've also gotten at used bookstores or like fill a bag sales where you're just like, sure, I'll give it a try. So it's kind of a mishmash of that sort of thing. I'm also really excited to read Dreadful Company. This is book 2. This is all that Barnes & Noble had, so I used my gift certificate on it. It seemed like the kind of book you could read out of order, so I just grabbed what they had. But This author was recommended by the author of The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, and it sounded so good. I am blanking on the name, even though I love The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, and I always follow her Instagram. I'm just having a brain fart, but anyway, it looks like a good kind of like gothy fun, which is, you know, my favorite brand is like fun but goth. So yes, there's so many books that sound good in here. It's overwhelming, honestly. But that's that. And now I'm going to show you my nonfiction bookshelf. It's pretty tall. Up here is kind of some random stuff because it's hard to reach. So there's like a little bit of astrology, learning Japanese, some novels, a couple of memoirs by blind people that I read to research Alfred. They're mostly books I'm probably not going to read that soon again. So they're out of reach. This is a similarly, like, this is actually some of the to be read pile for the most part. Nothing really particularly for world building there. But then we get into the shelf. Oh, you know, these are just in the way. We get into some of like the magical, mystical stuff. Encyclopedia of Spells and Encyclopedia of Spirits have been good reference for like when you just need a little fantasy, magical information. I have a feeling the Golden Bough is pretty out of date, but I got that really cheaply. Then this is one of my favorite books for inspiration. The Wand and the Word, Conversations with Writers of Fantasy. It's mostly like classic children's fantasy. Also the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien that I've read twice through already and could probably stand to reread again. Some of Ellen Montgomery's journals, I realized I'm actually missing some. And some other author biography type stuff, as well as self-editing for fiction writers, which I have recommended many a time. Similarly here we have some works by various writers and some writing books and more of my astrology stuff. Still not really quite into the thick of the world building at that point. Now this next shelf has books to inspire like European settings for the most part. I have the taller ones on the end, and you've got the Belle Epoque, Paris and the Glamour Years. This book, Voluptuous Panic, The Erotic World of Weimar Berlin, was basically, this book is what spawned my novel Dark Metropolis. It is just such a fascinating look at a moment in time that it really gave me story ideas. I've got a few books on Berlin in the 20s because of when I was writing Dark Metropolis. And then we've got books on medieval, on Dutch culture, 1700s, Georgian England, Victorian London, a couple of random history books. I have one paranormal romance that's set in St. Augustine, Florida, so I have a few books on that and just a few random pickups. And this one has a lot of books on particular like technology, customs, kind of specific things I might want to look up, like the history of telephones, the history of lighting, the history of timekeeping, shopping in the Renaissance, shopping like back in the day in America, outdoor recreation and leisure in 19th century America, customs and fashions in Old New England, books on the history of dining, kitchens, the history of the British royal household, housekeeping, several books on like the lives of housekeepers and like domestics, Lost Country Life, which has information on English country folk life, short history of technology, some old popular mechanics, history of like engineering projects in America. This book, New York Underground, was another one I used for writing Dark Metropolis. It's a history of what lies underneath New York and was extremely fascinating. So that book was set in like a fantasy version of Berlin, but I just wanted to get ideas for what would be underground for that book. And then a few more books, just history for places I've lived, not really world building. Then we have The Versailles and Marie Antoinette shelf. I wrote an erotic series called The Surrender of Sleeping Beauty that was very heavily based on the life of Marie Antoinette, but it was like fairy bondage Sleeping Beauty retelling. Somehow all these things went together surprisingly well, except apologies to Marie Antoinette, who probably didn't want to be involved in all that. But I've got a lot of very nice books on Marie Antoinette because I justified it as a tax deduction, and I really made use of them. So I've got a beautiful book on Versailles, a book on the fashions of the era, a visual guide to Marie Antoinette, and then Louis XIV Versailles, some biographies of Marie Antoinette, as well as Nancy Mitford's biographies on Louis XIV, Frederick the Great. And then we have just general, the courts of Europe, royal palaces, how governments work. The Lucy Maud Montgomery album was there because it's the only place it fit. Great palaces, I think. My mom got me this one for Christmas from a used book sale or something. This little Life of a Knight book is French, and they kind of recreated in photographs the life of a medieval knight. And it kind of reminds me of some of those picture books that I had in the 80s where they would do like Life with a Kitten or something, but with a medieval knight, which is really charming. And then I got these two, The History of Graphic Design books, which I did not realize would be too tall to fit in any of the shelves that I own. Kind of a little frustrating. The next shelf is not as tall, so I could pile my huge collection of vintage fashion magazines on top. Obviously, I had to turn them sideways, but they go back quite a ways, and I use them for reference quite a lot. Then I've got random stuff, very random stuff here on the top. Here we've got little history of shoes, look of the century. This is part of my vintage or antique photograph collection. I have this little book of cabinet cards and daguerreotypes I got at an auction, as well as my prized curated collection of cabinet cards. For the most part, there's a few postcards on top, but I've got some cabinet cards that some of you, they're upside down, but some of you may remember her. I used her as my avatar on Facebook as Lydia Foxglove before I finally was like, here's the real me. Maybe at some point I'll do a little tour of my photograph collection. Then we've got some random, these books I got at a used bookstore, and I don't know how accurate they are because they're not by someone with a Chinese name, and they're also older, but they do go into a lot of depth, so I still thought that they were kind of interesting. This one is like a travelogue of traveling down the Rhine, like before, I think, either of the world wars. Sometimes I like travelogues to give me a sense of like just old landscapes and like what you would see in tourism before like the modern, or like, I don't know what you define as the modern age, but you know what I mean. Buildings Without Architects, which talks about like basic architecture around the world, kind of like what peasants would be building around the world. It can be hard to find references for stuff that includes the entire world and not just Europe, so I often grab them when I see them. I got a couple of these Eric Sloane books with the drawings of like old tools and old country life, an old book on costume in America, fashion, and then some of my art inspiration books, Sketching for the Imagination and Art of Disney, and a book on Viking warriors, which had a lot of good pictures. Now this shelf mostly has photography, which I'm a real sucker for a good photography book. The first one, however, not photography. This is a book that has an illustrated diary from the Victorian era, and this book is so charming. I love it. It's rather hard to find. Then we've got guides to antique photographs. This Dress for the Photographer is one that I really love as a reference for seeing the small differences between fashions throughout the 19th century, because it really goes into a lot of depth about how to identify the era in photographs and in clothing. And we've got like the art of the American snapshot, photo booth. I really love August Sander's portraits from Germany, although I recently heard that part of the reason he took them was like to prove eugenics theories or something. So it's like, why does everything enjoyable have to be ruined that is old? I got some Irish ruins. Got these old photographs of the Russian Empire. This one is a real treat. This is some very early color photography. And he traveled all around the world taking it. So you really get a good look at like what people, like even in Europe before they were wearing, like they were still wearing kind of folk dress in Europe at this point. Or at least they had it to drag out of their closet for the photographer. So there's some really great photos in there. This one is another treasure. This is from an exhibition of early photography in China. And this seems to be an extremely rare book. I found it very cheaply at Wonder Books in Maryland. There's just some excellent photography in here. I'm also very fond of this book, which just has random pictures of collections of different old things. Like here's some door knockers, some old door knockers. Those are cool. It's the kind of just weird stuff. It's just weird stuff that you wouldn't think about. Like here's a whole collection of like old matchbook covers. I love this book from both a design perspective and for getting ideas for like little cultural things. A collection of old postcards going year by year. The Material World books. I love these. I'm not sure I've used them particularly for world building, but I do like them. And a couple of books on like Americana. The DK books on India and China. An old book on Japan. The next shelf gets into more like travel inspiration. There's a book on what Chinese houses were like. There's a couple, well, there's one. There's a book on festivals, maps, a couple of books on travel back in the day. One on like Golden Age hotels. And then we have some like design inspiration. Living in Morocco, Bali, Norway, Finland, Breton, Santa Fe. This Living in Norway book has, I just want to move into all the houses in this book. That is probably my favorite like house interior design book ever. I don't know if I really got inspired by accidentally Wes Anderson, but it is a fun one. Then we have like the food section, Food Lovers Atlas of the World, good for coming up with historical cuisine. And the Culinaria books also have a lot of information in that regard. And then Log Houses of the World, 14th century towns, French country house, Russian houses. This one came in at work and I was like, I'll take that one. I've already pulled this out to use as a reference for describing like some manor houses in a fantasy book very recently. And then more design. The Poster and History, fashion books, Life in the English Country House, Life in the English Country Cottage. Pretty much got every kind of ye old house covered some way or the other. Illustrated History of Interior Decoration. Here's one that is just on the art of the trimmings maker. You know, in case I ever want to really get into describing some trimmings. Interiors. The iconic interior. Farmhouses, plantation houses. This one has old photographs of Victorian houses. I have this idea that at some point I'm going to write about a character that lives on a little boat. I have used these All-American ads for reference so many times. My fantasy world is currently like in this era in most of the books I've been writing, so I keep looking at these to get an idea. These also have some old photographs, and one of these is like snippings from teen magazines that I made back in the very long time ago. These are a couple of my video game design books, which I have more. They're on another shelf. Everyday fashions from the Sears catalog. Oh, the camera's having trouble focusing. More design on the bottom shelf. Got mid-century shop designs. This Venetian villas one is a good chunky boy for inspiring some Venetian villas in general. Ghosts Along the Mississippi has like photographs of old crumbling plantation houses. Menu design in America, another good design one. This magic one has a lot of great art. Japanese costume, the fashions of Lucille, the worldwide history of dress, which has a little bit of the world, obviously, and world dress fashion in detail. Folk dress of Europe. This has pictures from like, you know, Godey's ladies book and so on. We've got one just on vintage hats and bonnets and what clothes reveal. Another one that has like details, but it's mostly colonial. The Kyoto Costume Institute. Victorian costume, 1920s, what people wore. This is another one that has the whole world. Folk and festival costume of the world. This one's a bit of a sleeper. This has a lot of just really great basic line art to give me ideas for different kinds of folk costume. More of the Sears catalog ones here. Got a binder of old teen magazines. And of course the other history of graphic design, which I just gotta jam in wherever I can stick it. There's not as much of the world building on these shelves, but this is a favorite art book, was Wendy Peeney's Elric art. And I've got like a mix of some graphic novels, some pop culture books. This is a yearbook from like the early 1904 in Maryland. And these are always, they have these little profiles of like every girl, maybe in like the senior class. I don't know if it was every one. Wah! More graphic novels on this shelf. This one's pretty much all graphic novels. And then a few art books and D&D. Then we have some like music reference books because some of my characters are rock musicians. So then I've also got some like Mick Rock, Maud, a very British phenomenon, Bowie style, you know, some various stuff for that. Another photographic book that kind of probably didn't fit over there. This is the kind of follow-up to Voluptuous Panic, the one on Weimar Berlin. This one is about the erotic world of Paris. Some books on like old Hollywood, which I'm putting a little used to right now, in fact. This is a fun one. This is a book that I found somewhere. It's a guide to throwing parties from like the 1920s. So if you need to know how to throw a 1920s style party, I've got the hook up here. I've got the fairy book put out by Enchanted Living magazine, which I also have many issues of Enchanted Living magazine. Those are great inspiration. Another history of graphic design. Some old yearbooks, some reproduction Sears catalogs, and we have some old children's books and other design inspiration. Some books by the artist who did Gnomes, as well as Gnomes itself. Fairies by Brian Froud. This book, The Empire of Death, really inspired the temples used by the death-worshipping Vendiri in my fantasy world. It's got the art of like macabre churches and such in Europe that use bones as decor. Got some old picture books. The Art of the Lord of the Rings, Tasha Tudor, East of the Sun, West of the Moon, some vintage fairy tales, the beloved Tasha Tudor books that are always good for inspiring me about like cottagecore life. Some actual catalogs from Sears, Ward, Penny's. I usually grab these whenever I find them if I can afford them. And then just kind of some random. So that was a tour of my reference and design bookshelf. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, it does not include like video game art, Yoshitaka Amino, but a lot of those appear in the video I did on art books that I love. And I just really love having my little library because sometimes I'm in the middle of writing a book and I'm just like, I need to see some pictures of like, you know, fancy manners, or I need to see what people were wearing in the 1920s. I will say that a lot of my fantasy is based on the 20th century, probably more so than most people, but I also have a lot of reference for earlier centuries. And I'm always, when I'm out at used bookstores, keeping my eyes peeled for new books, whether they're old or new, that just speak to me as a good reference book for my shelf. I hope you enjoyed this little tour. And if you have any great book suggestions for inspiration for fantasy world building, feel free to drop them in the comments. If you happen to be new here, I'm Lydia Foxglove. I'm a fantasy author. Here on my channel, I talk about writing craft, fantasy world building, the emotional and practical side of the creative life, and nerdy stuff. I hope you'll stick around, and if you've been around, I'm so glad that you're here. And if you can hear my cat crying piteously in the background, don't worry, I'm about to go visit her, but the tabby girls are fighting with each other, so I have one tabby girl chilling in here and the other tabby girl wants to get involved in her business. But anyway, if you want to hear more from me, also be sure to sign up for either my Patreon or my Substack. There's a free tier, same content on both, or the paid tier helps to support all of the content at this channel, as well as getting you access to my Discord server and bonus videos and other extras. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye! There's Puru. Don't worry. Only we're not gonna let Coco bother you.